Imagine, right? Just imagine for a second that you were designing the ultimate organism from scratch, like literally playing biology architect.
Okay, I like where this is going.
Right. So you have this one fundamental, unavoidable choice to make about its biology. Do you give this creature one massive, highly intelligent central brain so it can, make brilliant, unified decisions?
Right, like a supercomputer.
Exactly. Or, and this is the flip side, do you design it more like a swarm of ants? So no central brain at all, just like millions of individual nodes running on local instincts, which makes it basically impossible to kill.
Yeah, you step on one ant, the colony doesn't care. It just keeps going.
Exactly. And the thing is, every single time human beings sit down to organize anything, a business, a government, a community, or even honestly just a neighborhood group chat, we are forced to choose between these two exact biological designs.
We really are. And I mean, the hard truth is that neither design is perfect. It's literally the inescapable tension of human coordination. We're just constantly trying to decide if we want to prioritize the ability to act decisively or, the ability to survive a catastrophe. You can't really have both at the maximum level.
Welcome to this deep dive. Today, we are opening up just an incredibly fascinating set of analytical notes, research summaries, and reflections that deal entirely with this invisible architecture of power.
It's such a great collection of sources.
It really is.
Yeah.
The subject is centralization versus decentralization. But, and I want to be really clear here, if you're listening to this on your commute or at your desk and thinking, oh, great, this is going to be some dry corporate management lecture.
Please don't tune out.
Yeah, let me stop you right there. Do not tune out.
Yeah.
Because this is a master lens for understanding human power. Our mission today is to equip you with the framework to see the hidden machinery running your daily life.
The plumbing beneath the floorboards, basically.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We want to figure out why some massive, well-funded organizations feel so paralyzed by bureaucracy, right? While at the same time, highly passionate, unstructured groups fail to ever actually get a single thing off the ground.
Right. It really is a master lens because when you strip away all the politics, the business jargon, all the historical eras we're going to talk about, every system basically boils down to how it manages risk. Every time we build an institution, we're essentially placing a bet. We're choosing which kind of failure we are willing to endure.
Which failure we are willing to endure. That's...
No.
I want to start by looking at why we place those bets in the first place, though.
Yeah, the motivation.
Right, because before we get into the spectacular ways governments collapse or, businesses go bankrupt, we need to understand the emotional promises these systems make to us.
They absolutely make emotional promises.
They do. So let's look at the center first. The emotional appeal of centralization is, essentially, and I'm paraphrasing the notes here, we can act together. When you pull all the power into one single place, it feels like competence made visible.
Competence made visible. I mean, that captures the psychology of it just perfectly.
Right.
Because when people choose centralization, they're usually doing it out of a really deep-seated fear of chaos. They look around, they see fragmentation, they see everyone pulling in different directions, and they crave a bridge of steel over that chaos.
A bridge of steel. That's a great way to put it.
And structurally, I mean, you can't deny the benefits. You establish one clear chain of command. You get uniform standards.
No more 50 different ways of doing the exact same thing.
Exactly. You eliminate duplicated efforts. And if a crisis hits, you have a mechanism for rapid mobilization because nobody has to negotiate with 50 subcommittees to get permission to act. You just act.
Right. The source material brings up Thomas Hobbes here, which I think grounds this idea really well.
Oh, yeah, the Leviathan.
Yeah. So Hobbes was writing during the English Civil War, which was a time of literal warlords and massive, massive bloodshed. So when he looks at human nature, he has this profound intuition without a strong sovereign.
With single massive authority.
Right, without a massive concentrated authority that can just step in and say, the argument is over, I decide. Without that, people naturally slide into violent insecurity.
It's the war of all against all.
Yes. From his vantage point, concentrating power isn't some greedy power grab by a king. It's literally the most rational thing a society can do to stop bleeding.
Exactly. I mean, Hobbes represents the ultimate centralizing instinct. He firmly believed that dividing power meant dissolving power.
Dividing is dissolving.
Right. To him, the promise of the center is that if we pool our sovereignty, if we give up some local autonomy to a single head, we can finally move the mountain.
We can build the roads.
We can build the roads, we can win the war, we can enforce the laws, we can actually do things.
But then, and this is where it gets interesting, you have the complete opposite instinct, the emotional promise of decentralization. And the notes describe this feeling as, quote, we can breathe and still belong.
Breathe and still belong, yeah.
Which just hits a totally different psychological chord, right? Because, okay, going back to your metaphor,
Yeah.
a steel bridge is necessary if you're trying to cross a canyon, but nobody wants to build their house on a steel bridge.
No, it's cold, it's rigid.
Exactly. You want local autonomy. You want the rules of your life to actually fit the reality of your specific neighborhood, not some abstract blueprint drawn up 1,000 miles away.
Right, and that introduces the concept of subsidiarity, which is a major, major focus in the source material we're looking at.
Let's unpack that, because subsidiarity is a big word.
It sounds academic, but the principle is actually super intuitive. Subsidiarity is just the idea that power should sit as absolutely close to the people as possible. So, unless a higher central authority can demonstrably do the job better, like clearly objectively better, the power should stay localized. Decentralization promises that you can experiment. It promises that the people actually doing the work get to make the decisions about how the work is done.
Right.
And crucially, it promises protection.
Protection from the center itself.
Yes. Protection from overreach.
Yeah.
The core argument here from the decentralist side is that when you concentrate power, it doesn't just magically become wiser or more benevolent.
Oh, for sure.
It usually just becomes further away from the reality on the ground.
Okay, let me bring us back to that biological analogy we started with.
Yeah.
Because the source explicitly compares centralization to a single brain and decentralization to a swarm intelligence.
The ant colony.
Right, the ant colony. So centralization is your central nervous system. You decide to move your arm, the signal goes down, your arm moves.
Yeah.
Fast, clear direction. Decentralization is the ant colony, or like your immune system. It adapts, it routes around damage, it heals itself, all without a central commander.
It's purely organic.
But I have to push back on this idea of the swarm being some kind of utopian structure.
Oh, please do.
Because if decentralization is just a swarm of ants, how does a society actually build a bridge or an interstate highway system? I mean, I'm thinking about a decentralized potluck dinner, okay?
Oh, I love this analogy.
Right. If there's no central planner telling people what to bring, you end up with 14 bags of tortilla chips, 5 dozen cookies, and literally no actual main course.
And probably 3 different bowls of potato salad.
Exactly. Isn't a swarm just chaos if nobody is holding the master blueprint?
That potluck dinner analogy is brilliant because it perfectly illustrates what the researchers in the notes call the core paradox. You are completely right. A swarm does not have a master blueprint.
Not at all.
Even a queen ant doesn't issue step-by-step commands to the worker ants. She just reproduces. The swarm operates purely on local chemical signals. Ant A leaves a pheromone, and B follows it.
Right.
And that leads us to the ultimate trade-off. Centralization compresses power to gain coordination. But in doing so, it creates zero redundancy.
The single point of failure.
Precisely. If you have a single brain, you have a beautiful master blueprint for the potluck. Someone is checking off the list.
You bring the chicken, you bring the salad.
Exactly. But if you hit the center, like if the person organizing the potluck gets the flu and their phone dies, the entire event is canceled.
Oh, wow.
If you damage the central brain, you don't just injure the system, you own it or you completely break it. Decentralization, on the other hand, diffuses risk.
So if you hit one node.
Right. If you hit one node in a decentralized swarm, if one person forgets their bag of chips, the potluck still happens. You barely even slow the system down. The immune system just routes around the damage.
But the cost of that survival is that the coordination is totally messy. Like, the potluck survives, but everyone is eating chips and cookies for dinner.
That is the paradox in a nutshell. A system that is easy to control is often incredibly easy to cripple. A system that is hard to control is often incredibly hard to coordinate. You are always, constantly pulling a lever between gaining coordination and gaining survival.
So if you act like a mind, you risk sudden death by brain failure.
Yep.
If you act like a swarm, you risk never fully acting as one cohesive unit at all.
You just mill around.
Right. Which makes me wonder, if both of these structures have such obvious benefits, why do they so consistently lead to disaster in the real world?
Ah, the shadows.
Yes, and that brings us right into the shadows of these systems, the hidden bills that eventually come due. Let's dig into the hidden bill of centralization first. The source calls this shadow, quote, order that becomes fragility.
Because at first glance, a highly centralized system looks like a well-oiled machine. It looks highly capable, very impressive. But the notes bring in data from organizations like the OECD and the World Bank.
Really heavy hitters.
Yeah, massive data sets. And they warn that this visual order often hides a profound systemic blindness.
Okay, but how does the top actually go blind, though? If they have all the data flowing up to them, shouldn't they see everything? Like, I'm picturing a CEO sitting in a boardroom, staring at a giant digital dashboard where all the metrics from every department are just flashing green.
A beautiful dashboard.
Right. To the CEO, the company's in perfect order. They see everything.
But you have to ask, why are those metrics flashing green?
Okay.
That's where the mechanism of failure lies. In a heavily centralized system, the center holds all the power to punish and reward. All of it.
Right. They control the bonuses, the promotions, the firings.
Exactly. So local managers down at the bottom of the chain realize very, very quickly that sending bad news up the ladder gets them fired.
Oh.
So what do? They massage the data.
They lie.
They lie. They hide the inefficiencies. They force the messy local realities to fit into the rigid little categories that the central database requires. The CEO sees a green dashboard, sure, but the reality on the ground is bright red. The center loses the ability to process local reality because it has created a structure where telling the truth is basically penalized.
So the errors made at the top don't just stay at the top, they cascade.
They cascade everywhere. Because the center is dictating the rules for the entire system, one bad assumption at the top forces everyone at the bottom to do the wrong thing simultaneously.
Wow.
You create a total dependency on perfectly competent, perfectly informed leadership. And since perfect leadership literally does not exist,
No human is perfect.
right. So the system becomes incredibly brittle. It's like a diamond. It's very hard. It can cut glass. But if you strike it at the exact right angle with a hammer, it doesn't just chip. It shatters completely.
Okay, let's flip it. Let's look at the hidden bill of decentralization. The shadow here is described in the text as freedom that becomes incoherence.
It starts off looking so humane, so resilient.
It does. But the hidden cost is massive fragmentation. The notes specifically list things like uneven standards, wild regional inequality, and my absolute favorite bureaucratic term of all time, buck passing.
Buck passing is the quintessential failure mode of a decentralized system.
Okay, let's break that down.
Let's look at the mechanics of it. When you distribute power so widely that no single entity holds ultimate authority, you also distribute responsibility so widely that no one can be blamed. The World Bank research specifically highlights this danger in local governments.
I instantly think about a local zoning board or like a really messy homeowners association.
In classic HOA nightmare.
Right. Everyone wants local control over their own street. They demand autonomy. Don't tell me what color to paint my house.
Yeah.
But the second the road gets a massive pothole or the neighborhood sewage system backs up, suddenly the local board is pointing fingers at the county.
Yep.
And the county is pointing fingers at the state. And the state is begging the federal government for emergency funds.
Exactly. Badly designed local governments will completely manipulate their autonomy. They shift their liabilities upward. They fiercely resist any central oversight when things are going well.
Leave us alone.
Right. Stay out of our business. But they expect this central authority to bail them out the second things go wrong. And honestly, worse than buck passing is the risk of local capture.
What does that mean, local capture?
It means instead of dealing with a distant central tyrant, you end up dealing with a corrupt local town council or a regional warlord who uses the lack of central oversight to basically build a little fiefdom.
Oh, so you just swap a big dictator for a tiny one.
Exactly. And this perfectly sets up a psychological trap that the source material calls tunnel vision. Advocates for both sides get completely locked into their own blind spots.
Oh, this part of the notes was so good. According to the text, centralizers think that every single problem in an organization is caused by too many veto points, too much diversity of opinion, and just a lack of discipline.
They think everyone is just being insubordinate.
Right. While decentralizers think that every problem is caused by top-down oppression, endless bureaucracy, and out-of-touch elites.
It's a complete cognitive block. It prevents any kind of holistic problem solving because each side is literally only diagnosing half the disease.
There is a line in the notes that distills this so perfectly, I want to read it. It says, centralizers confuse uniformity with capacity, while decentralizers confuse autonomy with competence.
Let's really break that down.
Yeah. Think about a corporate mandate. Let's say the company decides everyone must use a single centralized software platform, or even just like one centralized coffee vendor for all the break rooms across the country, right? to save money.
Okay, so the centralizer looks at that uniformity. Everyone using the same software, everyone drinking the exact same coffee, and they assume the system now has the capacity to succeed. They equate sameness with strength.
Right.
But if the software is terrible, or the coffee tastes like actual battery acid,
Which corporate coffee usually does.
exactly, making a bad decision universal isn't capacity. It's just highly efficient self-destruction.
It's just forcing everyone to suffer simultaneously.
Right.
And on the flip side, the decentralizer says, no, let every department buy their own software. Let every desk buy their own coffee beans. They look at that autonomy and assume that because the groups are free, they will naturally be competent enough to make good choices.
But freedom doesn't magically bestow competence.
No. You end up with 20 different software programs that literally can't talk to each other, and expense reports filled with like $50 bags of artisanal espresso that just bankrupt the whole department.
That's the tunnel vision in action. And to understand why this tunnel vision is so persistent, we have to look at the ghosts these people are running from. Because this isn't just theoretical paranoia.
People are reacting to trauma, essentially.
Very much so.
Yeah.
The centralizing mind is reacting to the historical and structural reality of warlordism. They are looking at a fragmented world, like Hobbes did during the Civil War, and thinking, without a strong center, power doesn't just disappear, it splinters into a million tiny, vicious factions.
They're trying to outrun the ghost of chaos.
Yes. And the decentralizing mind is running from the ghost of tyranny. They are looking at the historical reality of empires and dictatorships and that deadening, suffocating reality of one-size-fits-all policies that just crush local culture.
Right.
They think, without dispersion, power doesn't become wise. It just becomes distant and cruel.
So if you want to understand your own workplace or your local government, you really just have to look at the rules being made. Like when management suddenly hands down a rigid, centralized policy, you have to ask, are they just being tyrants, or are they reacting to a period of past chaos where everyone was doing their own thing and the company almost went under?
Context is everything.
And conversely, when employees start ignoring rules and demanding autonomy, are they just being insubordinate, or are they reacting to years of suffocating micromanagement that prevented them from actually serving the customer?
It is always a reaction.
Always. Okay, so to prove that this framework isn't just an abstract thought experiment, the notes actually apply this brain versus swarm concept to real laboratories of history.
Yes, the historical stress tests.
Exactly. There are 3 historical stress tests in the material that show exactly what happens when you push these structures to their absolute extreme limits. Let's look at the first one. France under King Louis XIV, the Sun King. This is presented as the ultimate case study in centralization as state building.
It is the textbook example. The notes draw really heavily on historical analyses of his reign because he took a highly fragmented nation and forged a central government. You really have to remember the context here.
Right, pre-Louis France.
Before Louis XIV, France was constantly racked by internal rebellions. You had these powerful feudal lords who basically ran their own mini-kingdoms. They had their own armies, they collected their own taxes. It was chaotic.
Basically the warlordism ghost you were just talking about.
Exactly. So Louis centralized administrative and military power. He systematically weakened those feudal rivals to make the state's actions coherent.
Let's talk about the how here, because the mechanism he used is just wild to me.
Oh, the architecture of it.
Yeah. He literally built the Palace of Versailles and forced all the powerful nobles to come live there with him. He threw these endless, lavish parties, forced them to buy incredibly expensive clothes, and essentially bankrupted them through luxury.
It's brilliant, really.
Right, because they couldn't afford to raise private armies back in their provinces anymore. They were too busy keeping up appearances at court. It's an incredible strategy for visible competence. He literally brought all the decision makers into one single building.
It was a stroke of absolute tactical genius for state building. He created the ultimate single brain, and he sent out these intendants, basically centralized bureaucrats, to run the provinces instead of the local lords.
Here comes the hidden bill.
Here comes the bill. When you remove all the local power nodes and pull everyone into the center eventually loses touch with the edges. By forcing all the nobles to live at Versailles, they stopped knowing what was actually happening on their own farms.
Because they were never there.
Right. Over generations, this model, built on absolute concentration, accumulated deep systemic rigidity. The center could no longer process local reality. They literally couldn't feel the starvation happening in the provinces.
Wow.
And we all know what happens to the French monarchy a few generations later when that brittle diamond is finally struck by a hammer.
The French Revolution. The system just shatters completely.
Exactly.
Okay, let's look at the exact opposite extreme, the Holy Roman Empire, specifically after the Peace of Westphalia. The source presents this as the ultimate case study in decentralization as pluralism.
Yes. Westphalia in 1648, this treaty effectively ended the effort to build a centralized, universal empire in Europe. It basically sealed the fragmentation of the Holy Roman Empire into literally hundreds of autonomous sovereign entities.
Hundreds of them.
The appeal here was local autonomy. It was a hard limit on imperial concentration. The idea was that no single emperor could ever act as a tyrant over the whole structure again.
But the shadow is what they call a chaotic mosaic. If I'm trying to picture the mechanics of this, like, imagine trying to organize a unified military defense or negotiate a basic trade treaty, but you have to get agreement from 300 different princes, bishops, and free cities.
All of them have their own agendas.
Right. And they all have their own veto power and local interests. It just sounds impossible.
It was practically impossible. It suffered from intense provincialism. This is the medieval version of the swarm paradox. It was incredibly hard for an outside force to completely conquer the Holy Roman Empire in one sweeping blow because, well, there was no single head to cut off.
You'd have to conquer 300 different towns one by one.
Exactly. So it was resilient in its survival. But it was entirely, hopelessly unable to coordinate unified action. It couldn't mobilize resources on a scale that a centralized state like France could.
Which brings us to the real nightmare scenario in the notes, the Soviet Union.
The Soviet case is uniquely terrifying because it demonstrates both sides of the paradox failing simultaneously.
How is that even possible?
Well, it started as a machine of total hyper-centralized control. Through Gosplan, which was the Central State Planning Committee, the center tried to dictate the production of every single item in the entire economy, from tanks to toothbrushes.
The ultimate central brain. And I mean, it generated enormous power initially, right? Like rapid industrialization, putting a man in space.
It did. It moved mountains. But the central brain cannot process infinite local data. The gearbox eventually breaks. The center couldn't accurately price goods or predict local crop yields. So what happened? Local managers started lying to the center to meet their impossible quotas.
Just like the CEO's dashboard.
Exactly like the dashboard.
Yeah.
The information flow became entirely corrupted. And then, when the legitimacy of the central brain finally cracked in the late 1980s, the entire massive structure collapsed under its own weight.
And it fragmented into a swarm that couldn't even support itself. Because they had destroyed all the local organic economic structures decades earlier, there was literally nothing to catch them when the center fell.
Exactly. It was a centralized system that died of brain failure and then fragmented into a decentralized swarm of constituent republics that struggled immensely. Because the underlying architecture of local competence had just been wiped out.
Okay, let's bring this out of the history books and look at modern realities. The source brings up the U.S. response to the COVID-19 pandemic, which is fascinating because international bodies like the OECD looked at the United States and described its approach as, quote, almost fully decentralized, especially compared to its European peers.
It really is perhaps the most visceral modern stress test of this trade-off we've ever seen.
And the tunnel vision was just on full display. Like, depending on your mindset, you saw two entirely different realities. Decentralizers looked at the U.S. response and praised the flexibility. They saw states tailoring their lockdowns and mandates to their specific regional needs. New York could do what New York needed, and South Dakota could do what South Dakota needed.
They saw a resistance to an overbearing, one-size-fits-all central mandate.
Right. But centralizers looked at the exact same landscape and saw absolute horrific incoherence.
Yeah.
They saw mixed messaging, 50 different standards for public health, and states literally bidding against each other for medical supplies.
It proves the rule. Decentralized systems are highly adaptive. But in a fast-moving national emergency, that local adaptation can look and feel an awful lot like scattered chaos.
The notes also point to the European Union, specifically citing it as an experiment in that word we used earlier, subsidiarity. The text defines the EU as decentralization with a ceiling.
The EU is an incredible architectural balancing act. Their foundational treaties explicitly state that action should remain with the member states, France, Germany, Italy, unless action at the union level clearly adds value.
So they're actively trying to preserve the swarm-like national self-rule and cultural autonomy while still creating a central brain for things like global trade and major regulation.
That's the goal.
But wait, if subsidiarity means power stays local unless it has to move up, who decides when it has to move up? Isn't that just a recipe for endless bureaucratic warfare? Like you're just constantly negotiating where the line is between the nation and the EU. Doesn't the system just bleed energy trying to define itself?
You've hit on exactly what the source calls the permanent tax of the system. The permanent tax is constant negotiation.
That sounds exhausting.
It is exhausting. When you try to balance the center and the edges this carefully, you are doomed to endure endless disputes over competence, legitimacy, and whether Brussels is overstepping or underperforming. It is agonizingly slow.
Yeah.
But the architects of the EU would argue that this exhaustion is simply the price you pay to avoid succumbing to either tyranny or fragmentation. You bleed energy in negotiations, so you don't bleed actual blood on a battlefield.
Wow. That's a powerful way to frame it. Let's switch gears a bit, though, because the source material uses some pop culture analogies to make all this geopolitical theory stick, and they are honestly incredibly helpful.
I love these sections.
Sometimes a fictional world distills these truths better than a textbook. Take Star Wars. The notes compare the centralized fragility of the Galactic Empire to the resilient, decentralized swarm of the rebellion.
It's a perfect structural map. The Empire is the embodiment of pure centralization. They have a highly visible order, a uniform chain of command, rapid force projection. Their entire strength relies on scale.
They look terrifying.
Right. But look at their weakness. Catastrophic overconcentration. They build a Death Star. It's the ultimate central node of power. But if a single pilot hits a single thermal exhaust port,
Boom.
you don't just damage the ship, you cripple the entire infrastructure of fear.
It's the brittle diamond.
Exactly.
And the rebellion is the ant colony. They operate in local, distributed cells. They are spread out across the galaxy. If the Empire destroys a rebel base on Hoth, the rebellion doesn't die.
It just routes around the damage.
Exactly. Their strength is pure resilience. But their constant weakness is that they struggle immensely to coordinate. They always have to rely on impassioned speeches and, hope just to get everyone to act together, rather than just issuing a clear order.
It's the same architectural dynamic in Lord of the Rings.
Oh yeah, break that down.
So Mordor is this terrifying, hyper-centralized will. It's top-down unity driven by one eye. But destroy one ring, unravel that one central node of power, and the entire structure literally collapses into the earth. The orcs just scatter.
Right.
Meanwhile, the free peoples, the elves, the dwarves, the humans, are a decentralized, pluralistic alliance. I mean, it takes them hundreds of pages just to agree to form a fellowship.
They argue constantly.
It is agonizingly hard to get them to coordinate. But that deep dispersion is exactly why Sauron couldn't just wipe them out in one stroke.
And then the text brings in Star Trek to show us a hybrid model, which I think is so cool.
Right. The Borg represents centralization without a soul. Perfect, terrifying coordination, but absolutely zero autonomy or local knowledge. Every drone is identical. Right? But a Starfleet ship, or the Federation itself, represents a layered system. It has centralization, there is a captain, there is a clear chain of command, there are prime directives, but it is deeply tempered by role diversity and local discretion. The engineer has autonomy over the warp core. The medical officer has autonomy over sickbay.
It's a central brain that actually respects the expertise of its limbs.
Exactly.
I love that. The Borg versus the Starship, it really takes the abstract and makes it tangible. But now we have to take this X-ray machine we've been building and place it over the most volatile laboratory of all, modern politics, specifically the political divides within the United States.
This is a crucial section, and before we unpack it, let's be very, very clear about our parameters here.
Yes, please.
We are not here to play political referee. The source material approaches this topic with absolute clinical neutrality, and so will we. We do not care who is right or wrong on the policy. We are strictly observing the structural mechanics of political beliefs. We are looking at the architecture of the arguments.
Exactly. We're just looking at the bones. We are not endorsing any side's platform. And what the X-ray reveals here is really fascinating. The text argues that beneath all the loud rhetoric, the political engine in America isn't actually driven by strict, unyielding ideology. It is driven by underlying fundamental fears, specifically the fear of inaction versus the fear of collapse.
This fear versus failure engine is the master key for understanding polarization. Let's break down the democratic tendency first. The democratic platform often leans towards centralizing power in many domains: federal regulations, national programs. The text argues this is fundamentally driven by the fear of inaction.
Okay.
When they look at massive systemic issues like climate change, systemic inequality, or healthcare access, their primary fear is that if society doesn't act at scale, if we don't coordinate nationally, people will fall through the cracks and we will fail a moral test.
So to solve a massive problem, you need a massive centralized tool. You optimize for decisive collective action to ensure uniform protections.
Precisely. Now look at the Republican tendency, which often leans toward decentralizing power states' rights, deregulation, local control. The text argues this is driven by the fear of collapse.
The fear of tyranny.
Right. When they look at the machinery of government, their primary fear is bureaucratic overreach and the loss of individual liberty. They fear that if you concentrate too much power in Washington and that central brain makes a mistake, it ruins everything for everyone.
Right.
Therefore, they optimize for system survival and local autonomy. Decentralization becomes the rational tool to keep accountability close to the voters.
Their underlying instinct is basically, the closer power is to my neighborhood, the safer I am from a distant mistake.
Exactly.
But here is where the text points at a massive contradiction, and this is where the whole idea of rigid ideology completely falls apart.
Yeah.
The parties actually flip-flop depending on the issue. They totally reverse their structural preferences.
They absolutely do, and it happens constantly.
It does. The notes point out that Democrats, who usually champion federal standards and national cohesion, will suddenly become fierce advocates for decentralization when it comes to things like sanctuary cities, or protecting local cultural autonomy, or resisting federal mandates they distrust. Suddenly, they are the ones arguing that local communities should have the right to ignore the center.
Right.
And Republicans, who build their entire brand on states' rights and local control, will suddenly demand intense, uncompromising federal centralization when it comes to border control, national security, or enforcing certain economic priorities across the entire nation.
Which proves the master insight of this entire section. Political alignment in America is not about a rigid commitment to a specific structure.
It's not about the mechanism at all.
No, it is dictated entirely by trust and priority. Each party centralizes in the domains they trust and prioritize, and they decentralize in the domains they distrust.
Okay, but let me challenge that premise for a second. If it's true that both sides constantly flip-flop, and if both sides actually rely on layered governance and the basic structures of federalism depending on what suits them that day, why does the political landscape feel so rigidly divided?
Right.
Like if we are all just mixing and matching structures based on the issue, why does it feel like we belong to two completely incompatible species who can't even speak the same language?
That is the million-dollar question, isn't it? The source attributes that feeling of rigidity not to actual structural disagreement, but to the ecosystem surrounding the politics.
The media.
Think about the media ecosystems. They require binary narratives to keep you engaged. Primary elections reward absolute ideological purity and punish nuance. Political identity has merged so deeply with social identity that tribal signaling becomes far more important than structural pragmatism. You can't admit that the other side's structure might work for a specific problem because that looks like tribal betrayal. So the noise on television makes it look like a war of absolutes, but underneath, the plumbing is actually much more pragmatic.
Exactly. Underneath the noise, the text points out there are constant crossover instincts. You see Republicans who demand massive federal disaster aid when a hurricane hits their state. You see Democrats who demand intense local control when it comes to neighborhood zoning or community policing.
Right.
The boundaries are highly permeable. It all comes back to that underlying risk model. In any given specific domain, which failure does a person fear more, doing too little or doing too much wrongly?
Which failure do you fear more? That is such a clarifying question. So if politics is driven by those underlying fears rather than strict ideology, how does the structure of centralization actually interact with the heavy philosophical concepts we argue about all the time? Things like freedom, equality, and the free market.
That brings us to a really fascinating map in the source material, charting out what they call the 9 dimensions of power. And the setup here requires us to separate the machine from the product it creates. The text calls this the master insight. And it states quite simply, centralization is only asking where power sits. It's a purely mechanical question. Is the power in one room or spread across 10,000 rooms? Everything else, Freedom, equality, tradition, progress is a debate about what power should do. Centralization is just the skeleton. The values are the muscles and the intent.
It's the difference between the mechanism and the moral goal. A hammer doesn't have a moral alignment, it just drives nails.
Yeah.
Centralization just concentrates force. But how that force intersects with our values is really complex. Let's look at security versus privacy.
Okay.
Centralization strongly aligns with security. If you want a fast response to terrorist threats, sweeping surveillance to catch criminals, and highly coordinated enforcement, you centralize data and power.
But that is in direct tension with privacy. Privacy relies on less data concentration. It relies on fewer points of monitoring and fractured databases, which are inherently decentralized traits. It's the core paradox again. Centralization makes it easier to protect the system, but the exact same mechanism makes it incredibly easy to misuse that protection to spy on everyone.
Precisely. Let's look at another intersection. Individual versus collective. Centralization naturally aligns with collective goals. If you want to enforce a shared environmental standard across a whole country, you need central enforcement.
Right.
Decentralization naturally aligns with the individual. It protects personal variation and limits imposed uniformity. But even here, they don't perfectly overlap. You can have decentralized collective action, like a local farming co-op, or you can have centralized enforcement of individual rights, like the federal government sending troops to desegregate schools.
Okay, let me jump in here and question the axis of regulation versus free market. Because intuitively, the way we normally talked about it, we assume the free market equals pure decentralization and regulation equals centralization.
That's the common assumption.
And the text does acknowledge that free markets are inherently decentralized swarms, millions of buyers and sellers making distributed decisions based on local price signals. But the notes point out a massive caveat. Those free markets absolutely require centralized rule frameworks to actually function at all.
Yes, this is a profound nuance that often just gets lost in economic debates.
Think about a local farmer's market. It's totally decentralized, right? Just a bunch of independent stalls.
Yeah.
But what happens if someone sells poisoned apples or refuses to pay for the goods they took? You need a centralized court system to enforce contracts.
You have to have a baseline.
Right. You need a central authority to define property rights, prevent monopolies from forming and crushing the swarm, and basically maintain the currency everyone is using. So a free market isn't pure anarchic decentralization. It's a highly decentralized game being played on a heavily centralized board.
That is an excellent articulation of it. Even the most ardent free market libertarian relies on a centralized baseline of property rights and contract enforcement. Which brings us to the most philosophically rich intersection of all, freedom versus authority.
Oh, this is the big one.
Right. Decentralization points toward freedom in the sense of fewer imposed constraints. Centralization points toward authority in the sense of top-down decision-making. But the text synthesizes this beautifully by highlighting the absolute danger at the extremes.
Too much decentralization leads to freedom without coordination. And in reality, that often degrades into local tyranny or warlordism, which completely negates freedom entirely. Like, if there is no central authority to stop a local bully, you aren't actually free.
Exactly. And too much centralization leads to order without freedom. You get the stability of a prison cell. The text also touches on equality and tradition. Centralization can be used as a really powerful tool to enforce equality through wealth redistribution and leveling mechanisms. But historically, it can just as easily be used to enforce authoritarian tradition and suppress any progressive change.
It's just a tool.
Meanwhile, decentralization can preserve local traditions and shield them from a progressive center. But it can also be the very engine of progressive local experimentation, like states legalizing things before the federal government does. The structure is literally just a tool.
It is the machine that pursues the goal. Recognizing that really helps separate the structural reality from the political rhetoric. But the balance between the center and the edge isn't static, right? It's not like you design the Constitution, build the machine once, and just walk away.
Not at all.
The ground is constantly moving beneath our feet. We are dealing with time, technology, and psychology.
It is a dynamic living tension. The source material explains this through the concept of systems drift. History is essentially cyclical.
Like the rise and fall of empires.
Exactly. Systems naturally drift towards centralization over time because it is efficient. Power naturally accumulates in the hands of those who solve coordination problems. But as we discussed earlier, over time, that center accumulates rigidity, blindness, and resentment until it finally fractures.
And then the pendulum swings.
Right. When it fractures, the system decentralizes. It fragments. In that fragmented state, it gains resilience and local diversity, but eventually it accumulates so many coordination problems, extreme inequalities, and internal conflicts that society can no longer function effectively. People just get exhausted by the chaos and demand order again.
Bring back the steel bridge.
Yes. And so a new power center emerges and it re-centralizes. Empire to fragmentation. Fragmentation to reformation. And repeat.
But it's not just these massive historical macro cycles playing out over centuries. The text brings in this fascinating psychological layer that operates on a micro level. It argues that human psychology is the hidden variable driving all of this. There are fundamentally centralizing minds and decentralizing minds.
Yes, and this plays out in our everyday lives, in our homes and offices, not just in the halls of government.
The text says centralizing minds crave clarity. They want order, they want coordination, and they feel intense visceral stress when faced with ambiguity. They prioritize outcomes and clear systems. But decentralizing minds value autonomy above all else. They want flexibility, they want exploration, and they feel intense stress when they feel controlled or boxed in. They prioritize agency. I honestly love this concept because it invites you to basically psychoanalyze everyone in your life.
Oh, it's a very revealing diagnostic tool.
Think about your boss. Are they a centralizing mind who micromanages your daily tasks because the ambiguity of not knowing exactly what you are doing terrifies them?
That explains so much middle management.
Right. Or think about your spouse or partner.
Yeah.
When you go on vacation, are you the centralizing mind who needs an Excel spreadsheet with every single dinner reservation booked a month in advance?
And I might be guilty of that.
Well, while your partner is the decentralizing mind who just wants to walk out of the hotel lobby and see what neighborhood looks interesting. When you argue about the itinerary, you aren't really arguing about the restaurant. You are arguing about how your brains experience safety.
That is a profound insight. We project our internal psychological need for safety onto the external structures we build. But those structures are also heavily influenced by external forces we can't control, primarily technology.
Yes, the technology wildcard. Because technology fundamentally changes what is actually possible for a structure to achieve.
It shifts the boundaries.
The text notes that the early internet originally made decentralization incredibly viable on a massive scale. Suddenly, you could have a swarm, a global network of individuals that could coordinate, share information, and build complex software like Linux without any strict hierarchy.
It drastically lowered the cost of coordination for the swarm.
But on the flip side, modern surveillance technology, big data, and algorithmic sorting have made centralization far more powerful and far more risky than ever before. A modern tech CEO or a modern intelligence agency can control and monitor a global population at a scale that King Louis XIV couldn't even dream of.
Which raises an incredibly important question, one the source material points directly toward. Artificial intelligence?
Oh, wow.
Where does AI push this delicate balance? Will AI cause a massive re-centralization of human decision-making? Think about the core flaw of centralization, the blindness at the top. The central brain can't process enough local data. But if an AI node can finally process near-infinite local data in real time, it could eliminate that blindness.
It fixes the flaw.
Or conversely, will AI hyper-decentralize production and creativity, giving every single individual the generative power of an entire corporation?
It's the ultimate wild card. We really don't know yet.
We don't, but the text provides a grounding principle to hold on to here. Regardless of the technology, whether it's the invention of the printing press, the telegraph, or an AI supercomputer, legitimacy matters more than structure.
Legitimacy.
Trust is the invisible glue that holds the physics of power together. A perfectly designed, highly efficient, centralized system will inevitably fail if the people do not believe it is legitimate. And a messy, inefficient, sprawling, decentralized system will survive and adapt if people voluntarily cooperate and trust one another. Legitimacy is the final currency of any system.
So after deconstructing all the ways these systems fail, all the ways they drift over time, and all the ways our own psychology traps us in tunnel vision, we finally arrive at the blueprint. The source actually provides a toolkit for how to build systems that work. It moves us from diagnosing the disease to basically writing a prescription.
Yes. How do we synthesize these opposing forces?
So what does this all mean for you? How do you actually use this tomorrow? The text gives us a highly practical 4-question balancing heuristic. It's a toolkit you can use whether you are reorganizing your startup, running a community garden, or analyzing national policy. Let's walk through them. Question 1. How fast do we need to act?
Okay.
If you are in a crisis and need to act fast, you must centralize authority. If speed is less critical and exploration is better, you decentralize.
Makes sense. Question 2. How diverse are local conditions? If the conditions vary wildly from place to place, say managing water rights across different climates, you must decentralize. If the conditions are uniform like standardizing a USB port, you centralize.
Question 3. What is the cost of being wrong? This is about risk. If one mistake at the top ruins everything for everyone, you have to decentralize to diffuse the risk. But if a lack of action ruins everything, you have to centralize to force the action. And question 4. Where is the knowledge? If the knowledge required to solve a problem is hidden locally, on the ground, you decentralize. If it's aggregated, system-level knowledge, you centralize. Let's apply this to a startup scenario. You're building a tech company. The core code base, the underlying security architecture, a mistake there ruins everything. The knowledge is highly technical. You centralize that. But the regional marketing strategy, local conditions vary wildly. You decentralize that to local teams.
It's a brilliant, pragmatic checklist. Match the structure to the nature of the problem and the cost of failure. But the ultimate solution the text outlines, the true master architecture, isn't about just sliding a single dial back and forth between center and edge. It's about building a layered system, a hybrid architecture.
The text calls this the spine, the organs, and the limbs.
Exactly. A healthy, enduring system looks like a biological organism. You must centralize the core constraints. That is the spine. In a nation, that's the Constitution, national defense, basic universal human rights, and the core currency. The absolute baseline rules that prevent catastrophic collapse and warlordism.
The non-negotiables.
Right. Then you have the organ-system-essential coordination, shared frameworks, interstate highways, resource pooling. And finally, you deeply decentralize the execution, the daily life, and the possibilities. Those are the limbs: states, cities, local businesses, individual culture. The logic here is elegant and incredibly robust. The centralized core prevents the system from collapsing, and the decentralized limbs allow the system to evolve, adapt, and breathe.
To bring this all together, the text introduces one final world-building analogy that visualizes this synthesis. It describes a fantasy setting called Azima. It imagines a world that has to get this balance exactly right in order to survive a massive external threat.
I love this part.
In this world, you have Castleguard, which represents the centralized human kingdom. It's highly efficient, it has standard laws, it can raise an army quickly, but it is deeply vulnerable to the whims of a bad king. And then you have the Thylanus Forest, the decentralized elven clans. They are incredibly resilient, practically impossible for an invader to fully conquer because they just melt into the trees. But they are far too slow to ever unify against a massive world-ending threat.
And the extrapolation of this analogy is the synthesis we've been building toward. To survive, they cannot rely purely on the logic of the castle nor the logic of the forest. They have to build a layered system.
Hybrid.
Yes, they construct a high council that is centralized specifically to prevent war between the regions and to coordinate the military against existential threats. But underneath that, the regions remain fiercely decentralized to govern their own culture, their trade, and their daily lifestyle. The magic rule of this hybrid system and of any successful human institution is dynamic balance. The High Council cannot micromanage the daily life of the forest, and the regions cannot violate the core constraints of the council. It acts exactly like a human nervous system. It knows instinctively when to tighten and centralize under severe threat, and when to loosen and distribute power during times of peace and growth.
It's about designing a system that has the self-awareness to rebalance itself without tearing itself apart.
Yeah.
Which brings us to our final synthesis. We've covered an immense amount of ground today. We've gone from Thomas Hobbes and the English Civil War to the Borg in Star Trek, from King Louis XIV in Versailles to the psychology of your office coffee machine.
It's all connected.
It really is. But the overarching theme pulling all of this together is that every single system is in a constant high-stakes negotiation between control and survival.
That is the absolute essence of it. Centralization helps you act. Decentralization helps you endure. You cannot optimize for both simultaneously at the exact same level. You have to build the layers. You need the spine to act and the limbs to adapt.
So we want to leave you with a call to action. Look at your own life. Look at your workplace org chart. Look at your community organizations. Look at the policies in your local government. Diagnose the muddy waters. Are you currently suffering from the hidden cost of a brittle, over-centralized center? A leadership team that has gone blind to local reality and is enforcing a uniformity that is destroying capacity? Or are you suffering from the exhausting incoherence of a fragmented, decentralized edge? A group that has so much autonomy that it can't get out of its own way to actually build something. Use those 4 questions we talked about. Find the imbalance.
Because once you can actually see the structural tension, you can stop arguing about personalities. You can stop blaming the people and start fixing the architecture.
But before we go, I want to leave you with one final, lingering thought. Let's circle back to that technological wildcard we discussed earlier, artificial intelligence. We've established that the fundamental flaw of centralization, the reason the single brain becomes brittle, goes blind, and eventually shatters, is the human inability of a central authority to process infinite local data. The CEO's dashboard eventually turns into lies.
The bottleneck of human cognition.
Right. But what happens when a future artificial intelligence can perfectly process infinite local data in real time? What happens when the central brain is no longer blind? Does an AI superintelligence finally solve the core paradox? Does it allow us to build a perfectly centralized system that has zero fragility, one that can perfectly tailor its control to every local nuance without ever breaking? Or does it just create the ultimate unfixable single point of failure, a bridge of steel so vast, so incredibly complex, and so deeply embedded in our lives that we won't even realize the underlying architecture is broken until it shatters completely and takes everything down with it?
Now, that is a question that will define the next century.
Something to mull over on your commute. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive, and we'll see you next time.